All right, Navy versus Wellington. This has been one of a few games that I have struggled with for a long, long time. Oddly, and I almost suspected this would happen, it mostly clicked for me playing it on video. Maybe carefully going through the rules with a fine-tooth comb and considering them. And I'm not saying I didn't make mistakes, maybe some pretty big ones, to tell you the truth. There certainly were quite a few in my play, but I felt like I got kind of what the flow of play was supposed to be and how to manipulate my units in a fashion that worked. Now, I think back in my 30s, when I last played this, I think I kind of got the mechanisms right, more or less. Again, whatever. But I don't think that I got a really good grasp of where the game would end up going. I don't really remember how I played them. I don't think I broke down a lot of units for skirmishers back then either. I think I just felt completely handcuffed, like I could not afford to advance with my French units who were clearly supposed to be on the attack, that I would get wiped out. Possibly using skirmishers properly, I could have avoided that fear, but I still wouldn't have been able to achieve the victory conditions in the time race that I believe you're required to do on it. But when I first got this game, it was just impenetrable to me. And that may have also influenced me throughout time, where it just became kind of this mental block towards playing it. But after this playthrough, I feel like I have a much, much better view of the game as a whole. Part of it being that I know I want to hit Wellington's victory. And the system for Ney versus Wellington is the same system, more or less, as in Wellington's victory. It's also a very similar version of it was used in a slightly later game, Monmouth, which I didn't have as much trouble with, but which was lacking some of the more complex elements. For example, skirmishers and cav charges were not present in that game. So I dealt more with just the fire and shock combat and stuff like that. And it's an okay game, you know. Anyway, for this one, let's touch on components first, I guess. The counters, standard SPI quality matte counters, very nice. I had a little trouble reading, especially the French counters. The dark on dark print is hard for me to see, especially under my lighting with my glasses, whatever. But there's one key aspect of these counters that I find problematic. Which is that there just aren't enough of the markers. There's not enough strength point loss markers. There aren't enough disordered and route markers. They're probably, like, I didn't ever run out of skirmishers because I didn't use them as much as maybe one might. There might not be enough skirmishers which are back printed with other markers. So you're going to have to bring other markers into the game. I also found that I was using, I decided that for artillery ammo, I would use counters that are designated for that from Terrible Swift Sword, which are parenthesized numerical markers, distinguishable from, the regular number markers in this game. It's not a big deal for somebody who has a lot of war games hanging around and who has some blank counters hanging around and stuff like that. But, what if you grab this game remembering that you enjoyed it, bring it someplace that is not filled with wargame counters, numerical counters and whatnot, and you forget that you need a whole bunch more to support this game. Well, you're going to have a hellish time. You're probably going to be pulling out coins and trying to use them and shit like that. And, it's just sort of the counter sheet. SPI went to larger counter sheets, I think, later than this. I'm not sure. There seems to be a fair number of counters here. Let's see. Did they tell me how many? 255. That's the size. Yeah, that's their larger counter sheets. So I don't know. For Sicily, Race to Messina, they put out, I think, another 100 counters and packaged it with it. But, they couldn't afford to do that with every game or anything. Anyway, this one comes with that. The map, I find it visually attractive. I don't think that there was much that I found terribly painful about it, although I don't know. Yeah, I don't think there was anything too terribly painful about it. There were a couple of charts or whatever on the map that would have been more valuable to have separately, but they're also in the rulebook. I think what you might want to do is make a little photocopy of them and hand them out to the players. Wellington's Victory comes with player aids. You could conceivably use those. Some very, very different combat results tables, which are relatively cumbersome to use. And one of the aspects of it is that you have to paw through your counters quite a bit, because you have to look up the strength of the counters, you have to look up which might be on a counter underneath, you have to look up the effectiveness rating of the unit that's firing, and that's not hard to see if there's no disordered counter or something on it, but disordered counters tend to accumulate. I found that the fire combat results table requires, even if you have all that information in your head and you're ready to use it, a number of different lookups, because you have to look up the type of unit here, the firing, the number of strength points that the unit has. That finds you a wide column. Then you look up the firing quality there. And then you look up the target class of the unit you're hitting to find the particular column that you roll the die on. It's a significant amount of lookups, which slows down the fire combat system. The rule book is problematic. It is an attempt to pack a 20-page rulebook from Wellington's Victory into, 12 pages in this? So examples were left out. Sometimes sections that were clearer in Wellington's Victory have been made shorter. Sometimes important parts of the rules have been omitted. And that's all leads to a certain number of ambiguities, some absolute contradictions. Those contradictions exist in Wellington's Victory, but there's stuff in the rules of Wellington's Victory, for example, that make it clear why that was present. Wellington's Victory also contains designer's notes, which this does not, which explain why the designer picked certain things so that you can better understand the intention behind the rules and make more informed choices as to, how you're supposed to interpret them. Another factor with the rules is that Wellington's victory system was designed for the Battle of Waterloo. In particular, the sequence of play of this game, which is a weird asymmetrical sequence of play, is taken straight from Wellington's victory, and that sequence of play is designed with the mindset that the Allied forces are on the defensive and they're on ridge lines where they have a good view of what the opponent is up to. Whereas the French forces did not have, in particular Napoleon, did not have a very good overview of what the battlefield, of what was going on the battlefield. And some peculiar advantages to the defending side are given in there. So Wellington's victory was never designed to be a generic system. The fire combat results table was. But anyhow, for whatever reason, in very different terrain, under very different circumstances, they decided to use the exact same sequence of play for Ney versus Wellington. Does it cause problems? I don't know. I don't think it's all that terrible, but it's clearly not supposed, it was never meant to be used that way. And you can't convert it trivially because the fire combat results table is designed for there to be a single fire phase every game turn. You would have to reduce the amount of casualties to be able to create a symmetrical combat, a symmetrical sequence of play that contained fire phases in each player's turn, right? So that's one of the major factors in it, was that decision. And if you look at Monmouth, which also used a similar system, they did not go with the asymmetrical sequence of play. They went with a symmetrical one and modified the combat results table for a couple of reasons, right? Some of it is you weren't looking at the same kind of massed fire formations in play that you would later see in the Napoleonic era. And, some of the techniques of fighting were a little different. The artillery tended to be smaller, all kinds of stuff like that. So there were a lot of tweaks made to the Monmouth system to make it apply to that battle. Which, it's like the way Stonewall was designed with a slightly different combat design from the Terrible Swift Sword system for various reasons. There, I think it was an attempt to correct for the casualty numbers you get from TSS. Jumping back to the combat tables, the shock table is not as painful as the fire results table. You're basically going to compare two things for that. A ratio of the strength points between the two units, and then a differential in the quality and positional advantages and such not between the units. And that'll get you, so you're basically comparing two values to get which chart you roll on. As opposed to, with the fire combat, you're comparing, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, I think 4 different values are all being cross-referenced there. All that means with the 4 values is that your mind is forced to make a lot of different steps to find the particular column that you're on. And given that some numbers are, obscured because of counters being on top of the number that you actually need, etc., you're going to have to paw through to find things every single time. And I found finding shortcuts to simplify the system was just more difficult. You add to that the weirdness of the reciprocal fire phase, which is peculiar in the sense that you're alternating, each person picks one unit and fires it. Well, they pick a unit from one side of their line, and they fire that unit, and then they work their way down the line, but the other person gets to pick a unit from either side of the line as well, probably the other side of the line, just so that they're not just following you and constantly firing after you. And, you know, they're each alternating to fire. It means that, and then also the fact that artillery fire is separate from infantry fire. That caused me some issues, because you're looking through all the units basically for infantry fire, but for artillery fire, you kind of have to remember where the artillery is. I had a gun hidden under a disordered marker that basically never got to fire because I would never see it during the artillery fire phase. And then I would see it during the infantry fire, and I'm like, well, it's too late, man. I guess I could have squeezed it in each time. Again, depends on how friendly a game you're playing. I was playing it against myself, so it wasn't friendly at all. No, I tend to be very harsh on trying to leave mistakes and not let people take things back. Although I did do some in this because I was struggling with the system at times. So the sequence of play is kind of weird in the sense that most I go, you go games are, okay, I do this in my turn, I do this in my turn, I do this in my turn. And maybe there's a little bit of reactive capability that your opponent has in that. But for the most part, one player is doing all the stuff, and then the other player gets his turn and does all his stuff. Other types of systems have pulsing type designs, think CDGs here, or some of the victory game stuff or something, chip pull systems, where you're activating one small group or one unit or whatever and doing something with it, and then another unit is activated or whatever. Those are kind of familiar to us. In this, it's different. It's that there's an interleaving of the activities. You kind of see this in some of the World War II operational stuff, where somebody gets an opportunity to react, to do a reaction move. They have phases in there, but it's different and more frozen, or it's differently constructed here. Which is to say, I'll take a look at what I'm going to call the Allied turn. The first thing that happens in it is the French declare their charge zone, right? Whether or not, well, they actually are declaring charges with their cavalry. And that's going to have an impact on the Allied movement capabilities. It also has an impact on their morale, etc. And then the French get to rally, but then the Allies get to do their movement functionality, and then the French get to shock. It actually works really, really well, I think. I like the way this interposes itself, because the Cav, so without having to create sort of special rules where the Cav are able to do a lot of opportunity type actions. They do have some capability for it in here. But they're able to project their power appropriately without too much of that power being opportunity functionality. And it allows the opportunity charges to be limited to a very small distance and stuff like that. So I actually think that the core of the sequence of play is really, really intriguing. And probably the strongest feature of this game, of this system to me. It creates some of the elements of Napoleonic warfare without becoming too cumbersome in and of itself for that. But let me check my time on this thing. Yeah, we're gonna need to compound the video, so I'm gonna pause and reload batteries. Whoa! Almost knocked over my lamp there. Routing, once units start routing, it's a fairly severe problem. You have to keep throwing your commanders back deal with that, and that means that the morale of your units is going to be more and more problematic. The movement itself, I played with an optional rule that allows you to combine the two kind of movement phases. One is a facing and formation, the other is a march phase. There might be some material differences in playing with that optional rule. I think for the most part, they're ones that just smooth play. And that make it so that you don't have to pre-calculate where everything's going to be before you start moving your pieces. And I would have probably made up this as a ease of play and damn the fact that it might impact some of the effects. Because one of the problems that I've had with the game is that when you start making systems complex and unfamiliar, this happened to me in Summer Storm, happens here a little bit, and too cumbersome, it starts generating mistakes which defeat whatever special historical accuracy might be gained by this more clever design, right? If the design now eventually, maybe players become so used to playing that design that they get comfortable with it and they're not making all those mistakes. But when the majority of the hobby has gone a certain way, it's unlikely, unless you devote yourself to just, that one game or whatever, it's unlikely that something that branches off too far and is cumbersome and kind of painful is going to really gel, and you're gonna internalize the functionality of the gameplay. That's a hard thing to criticize. It's sort of like the Betamax VHS thing. Yeah, Betamax was supposedly better, but they lost, right? You could have a more historically accurate game that could be just as easy to play if you got it down right. But because 98% of games work off a different mechanism, the fact that this is alone is just going to make it more painful unless you devote, all your gaming to that and hope somebody makes other things that are like it, even though it's gone, right? So that's one of the things I found. I did find this more cumbersome, though, and I think it just is when you look at this combat results table compared to some of the, the TSS or CWB type systems. NBS would be the best comparison. Once you compare it to those, you start saying, okay, this is coming with a higher burden, and is it getting me a little bit more accuracy? I don't know, maybe in some cases. I'm not convinced in all. In particular, unit casualties. Now, I think that there's a lot of abstraction going on in unit casualties, and I think what they really are is cohesion hits. I don't think that they're actually, when you lose a strength point, you're losing 100 men as being effective. I really don't think that's what's meant to be described there. I think it's more like the cohesion hits in, say, a GBOH type game. There are casualties present. There's lingering effects to the unit from, the damage that it's taken, etc. But the way that they're treated, essentially they become morale hits. Your fire effectiveness drops a little bit due to losing strength points. Your shock effectiveness drops a fair amount, more than the fire effectiveness, I guess, due to losing strength points. But the biggest thing that happens is each strength point you lose a point of morale. And it's very likely that your units are going to become disordered, which makes them much, much less effective, or routed, which basically it doesn't knock them out of the game forever, but it makes them start running away, and you have to run your leaders after them to get them to rally. it feels to me like there's an abstraction there. Now, here's the problem with that interpretation, because that's what it looks like to me. The designer was talking about how he's looking at the casualty rates, and that they came up with, that this kind of bloodiness is supposed to reflect those casualty rates. I'm not sure I believe him. I mentioned during one of the videos this guy Jason, who had done some research into the artillery casualty rates. And if he's looking at casualty rates, if Davis, the designer of the system for Wellington's victory, is looking at casualty rates, his numbers are just way off. Like, actual artillery casualties to infantry units appear to be really, really low, and he's getting huge numbers off of artillery fire here. Might be that massed fire of infantry units is reaching the right levels. But, yeah, and, there would be ways. See, if the designer hadn't said this, I would be passing it off as it is just a matter of there's an abstraction at play. But the fact that he actually pointed out that he was matching the casualty rates here, that leads me to wonder about his trustfulness or trustworthiness. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I found his designer notes in Wellington's victory really, really... By the way, the designer of this is Balkowski, not Davis, who designed the system. This is one of two games that Balkowski designed in '78, one of his first two games. So, and it was translate Wellington's victory into a shorter rule book that covers, this battle. And that may have been a poor decision, probably not on his part, probably on Dunnigan's part as to assigning people what to do. Anyway, trying to see if I have anything else here. Yeah, so the game uses an army morale system, as does Wellington's victory. And basically each strength point you lose costs you an army morale. You're losing effectiveness, which is firepower and ability to stay in the line, on the unit level for each strength point you lose. You're losing a point of army morale, you're losing a point of army morale for each of the strength points that you lose when fighting, essentially. Leaders also count, and all kind of other things. Well, not all kind. This is less comprehensive than Wellington's victory in terms of where the morale points go. When your morale hits 0, your army is demoralized. In Wellington's victory, that is a sign that you have to get that force off the map. In this game, it is just part of the victory conditions. And that's something I want to talk about, because the victory conditions are kind of ludicrous, at least on the situation that I had. So, for the French to win the game, they have to demoralize the Allied army and not be demoralized themselves. To get higher levels of victory, they have to obtain certain terrain objectives in addition to those base conditions. For the Allies to win, their marginal victory is neither or both players' armies are demoralized, and there's no French combat units, and they prevent the French from making certain terrain gains. Their more decisive victory conditions involve demoralizing the French army. Now, there is something kind of interesting, which is, let me see. there's a pure error in the victory conditions, which is it is possible if the Allies were to demoralize the French, but lose a lot of ground to them, the game would end up as a draw. But well, I don't know if it's an error. I don't know if it's an error. Yeah, it is possible if the Allies demoralize the French and the French advance into enough ground, it'll end up as a draw. So the ground is really important to the Allies. This is where I'm having a problem with the victory condition, because when I see army demoralized, I'm thinking in the Wellington's victory terms here, which is that, look, you would not want to stick around if your army is demoralized, right? This game creates victory conditions that I just don't feel are realistic for the Napoleonic era, which is your army is demoralized, but you're still trying to hold the fucking ground. And that was sort of the last straw for me, and I'm just like, yeah, you know, I fought really hard for my French to demoralize the Brits, and then in terms of how the French would try to achieve a victory, they would withdraw from the British. They've been on the offensive this whole time. They would withdraw from the British. And it's the only way that they were likely, with the amount of game that was left, that to win the battle. They've demoralized the enemy army. They can't get anything more from fighting it. And they could not advance into, like, any attempt to win a more significant victory would probably end up with them actually either losing the game or getting a draw. Whereas the Allies, if the French do withdraw, would be put on the offensive with their demoralized army. And I'm just like, this is crazy what is coming out of these victory conditions in this circumstance. I'm told that most games of this result in a draw. I've also been told that the French are likely to lose. And I can see why if you play it by these victory conditions. Historically, the French essentially lost or failed to do anything, failed to accomplish the results that were desirable. There's no question of that. But, and I can't talk really about the balance in this game because, first of all, once I see those victory conditions and started comprehending what they what impact they had, like on how the play would be. The British are on the defensive until their army's demoralized, at which point they go on the offensive to try to win the game. Whereas the French, the way my French played is they went whole hog on an assault and took heavy casualties. So their morale was getting weakened to the point where they could not have pressed the British any further after the British were demoralized. So the best option that they had would be to withdraw. And it just feels like the wrong side is like avoiding combat now and all kind of weird stuff. And it disturbed me too much. And I'm just going to leave it at that, I guess. Wellington's victory has much more reasonable victory conditions. I think these victory conditions work if you don't want to take reality into consideration. If you do start taking reality into consideration, there are problems. There are also problems with the line of sight rolls in both of the games. But again, like a number of the ambiguities and contradictions, they may not actually ever occur. You may not be put into a position where those line of sight rules just simply don't work. But those line of sight rules were designed, once again, for the Waterloo battlefield, which involves ridge lines. This one, I could actually construct situations, I believe. It's hard to tell because they use a formula instead of the same. They use a formula that's meant to duplicate a mechanical procedure. But I think they do the same thing. But I think I can construct a situation where something can't see something else when it probably should be able to. For example, on a constant downslope, it is possible with nothing in the way for part of that downslope to just block your vision. I have not yet opened up my Wellington's victory maps and laid them out to see. I'm assuming, I'm seeing stuff that's going to be problematic there as well. So I'll go into it when we hit that. So my assumption had been that it would just be that the translation of the game's line of sight rules to this are the problem. There's a reason the line of sight rules aren't what you expect, though. The map is done in a layer cake. Reality is not a series of mesas stacked on each time. Like, layer cakes don't actually exist. So if the terrain's being represented as a layer cake, you're not getting the reality in play. Now, I think CWB came up with Dean Essig with CWB came up with the answer for this, which has to do with which way the slope is going and being able to try to find where the spine would be between two, where the crest of the hill would be. The designer for Wellington's victory actually went into, if you actually drew a crest on the board, it would be incorrect, and it would give some improper consideration. The nice thing about it is that those lines of sight may not matter in most cases, because you're probably not going to be firing your artillery at long range very often, at least in this one. I also found that artillery was exceedingly mobile, more so than I felt like it should be. I'm able to limber guns, move them a couple of hexes, and then unlimber them and fire in the next fire phase that shows up, which felt a little bit too kind to the artillery. It wasn't crazy, but it felt a little bit too mobile for my taste. The game system is supposed to really show the power of skirmishers. It's designed to do so. It didn't feel like they were all that effective in this particular circumstance. Mainly because my feeling with the French was they need to win the game very quickly, because the Allied victory conditions, the Allied morale starts out very low, but grows as they keep getting more and more reinforcements into the field. The French morale starts very high, but their only chance to win the game involves breaking the Allied morale, which has to be done quickly. And I felt like the kind of mechanisms that the designer put in for skirmishers to sort of protect advancing forces and everything in Wellington's victory would preclude the French from ever being able to break the Allied morale. The Allied morale would increase too much. And it was a close run thing that I managed to break the Allied morale in the game that I played. And I could only do it by taking far greater losses on the French army and continuing on. I'm still kind of half and half on whether or not I should have quit. because if demoralization didn't mean demoralization, but I don't know what it means then, right? Like, I'm trying to think what it could possibly mean. Why is it important that the French do X amount of damage to the Allied forces and then withdraw from the field and form a defensive position somewhere? Why would that be their victory condition? Under what circumstances could that possibly be what they would want to do? I can see circumstances where the Allies would want to cause more damage to the French in their withdrawal, but that's also not what would happen. If the French followed this strategy that I believe would be their optimal in the situation we were looking at, the Allies would take their demoralized army and launch an assault with it, an all-out assault. Because what they have to do is they have to crush the French morale. Now, they could be careful with it, etc. Unlike the French, they're not on a time limit, except for the length of the game. But, yeah, they would be almost certain to pull a draw out of the game. Well, actually, they would pull a victory out of the game. They would pull a minor victory because the French would have pulled back. If the French continued with their attacks, they would end up demoralized as well, which would mean that it would be either a draw or an Allied victory. So there's something just fundamentally wrong with the victory conditions. And that was sort of my last straw, where I just like, this game was not designed carefully nor well. It doesn't reflect the reality properly. It was an attempt to patch a system that was designed for a specific battle, a specific battlefield, very certain conditions, and they didn't go out of their way to modify that system to reflect what actually would have been happening here. And where they did, like with the victory conditions, the novice designer, and his even younger rules editor ended up, not coming up with something that I think is all that great. All that said, I had fun. I had fun that I've never had with this game before. I enjoyed a great deal of watching it play out. So I don't know what to say about it, I don't have a lot of respect for it. I think it's cumbersome and painful and not worth learning this system just for this. But it's also not a complete waste, I guess. As was brought up to me, though, it's a very highly rated game, or was among the magazine games. I look on a site, it's one of the 20 SPI games you absolutely should have. There are some fantastic ones on there. You know what I didn't see on there? I didn't see the Desert Fox on there, which I actually think is one of their absolute best. Of course, people who say things like, people who are rating things, etc., maybe, they have their own biases, so they may have been kind of anti-Berg, because I don't remember seeing anything by Berg on there. But yeah, I think the Desert Fox is one of the best things that came out of SPI. And I see this there, but I see other things that I completely agree with, like Winter War, which is a fucking fantastic game. I don't know. I'd have to look again to see what's on that list. But yeah, look, people have different tastes. One thing I can tell you is that what's popular, World War II, American Civil War, Napoleonics, If you go outside that realm, you start getting into fuzzier areas, right? Areas that just didn't generate. So that's part of it. It's Napoleonics. Napoleonics was popular at this point. It maybe has lost some. I'm not sure. I certainly feel like I see more devotion to World War II and to American Civil War than to Napoleonics. But that may have been the case even back then. And also, if you look at its rating, it's not a great rating. It's an okay rating. right? I think to some extent it was, hey, look, here's a standalone way to play the Wellington's victory system without a monster game. It fits on one map. Nothing on Wellington's victory fits on one map. The smallest scenario, I think, is a two-mapper. And it may not use all of two maps. So I think that may have been some of the focus towards it. But I hear from people who, never played Wellington's victory who are saying they really liked this one. I kind of see it. I can kind of see it. There's an interesting situation there as to how can you get the French, getting the French to break the Allied morale felt kind of exciting to me. When I got to the actual victory conditions and started looking at what it would necessitate after a French victory, after the French demoralized the Allied army, I just threw my hands in the air. It may be a valid game still, it may be nice for balance in the game or whatever, but the historical situation that it necessitates is just obscene to me. And again, that's why that was the last straw. It's just I don't need to spend time watching an Allied counterattack with their demoralized army, because if they can demoralize the French, they win too. It felt so unrealistic. All right, let's send it up.